David Lynch's impact on modern culture and art is truly immeasurable. I mean that literally. He was perhaps the first mainstream American director to dive headfirst into surrealism to the extent that he did. Filmmakers like Hitchcock and Kubrick, of course, experimented with dreamlike scenarios and vivid, unsettling imagery in their films in a mainstream context first. But even Kubrick wouldn't dare release a film as experimental as Eraserhead or Lost Highway. Nowadays, it's hard to find anyone who isn't at least aware of his incredibly popular genre-bending series Twin Peaks. Not only did it find the perfect balance between eerie surrealism, unexplainable plot points, actually grounded emotional story moments, goofy humor, and flat-out horror, but it popularized highly serialized hour-long dramas on television, the kind of shows that were filmed with the exact same care and attention as high-budget cinema. Nowadays, every single big show is like this, but Twin Peaks was the first smash hit to truly follow this formula. Not only this, but it put David Lynch on the map. He was well known in film circles, and maybe you knew him as the guy who did Dune, but Twin Peaks made him a legend. I bring all this stuff up because this influence didn't just extend to film, art, music, and television. Once video games taking narrative seriously became more prevalent around the 4th and 5th gen, you started to see this influence take shape in that medium as well. This isn't going to be an exhaustive list of how many video games are inspired by his work and to what degree. It just seems like such a daunting task, and it would be impossible to truly quantify that. Hell, even Animal Crossing New Horizons has a subtle reference to the song James Hurley sings in Season 2. But I want to take a look at 3 favorites of mine that feature heavy inspiration from the director. There will be spoilers for all 3 games I'm discussing here, as well as Twin Peaks, and minor spoilers for Lost Highway and Mulholland Drive. So don't say I didn't warn you. First up, I want to talk about a highly controversial game, Harvester. One thing in video games that certainly goes well with David Lynch's particular type of horror is the uncanny feeling of old PC games, and one of my favorites of the time was undoubtedly inspired by his work. Harvester is a really weird, really violent, admittedly off-putting and edgy PC game released in 1996. The game revolves around a man waking up with amnesia in a town where nothing feels quite right. He has no idea where he is, and everyone seems to be obsessed with this esoteric lodge in the middle of town. I'm not here to give an exact rundown of the plot of Harvester. It's a relatively short game, and some of its more violent moments and quote-unquote jokes have aged really poorly, but there's something to be said about the game's absolutely dreadful atmosphere. It pretty much carries the entire experience for me, as the gameplay itself is not very good at all, and the 2 endings are either edgy or lame, though I suppose it's trying to make a statement about whether or not violent video games actually cause violence in the real world. What really drives Harvester and makes it feel almost like a David Lynch-directed video game is its art style. The diner, the twisted characters, the overt 50s Americana. It's hard not to draw similarities here to Twin Peaks. Like the show, Harvester provides a town in which it's impossible to deny that something is seriously off, even in the beginning before things get openly violent and surreal. The more you explore the town, the more absolutely repulsed you are by it, and it's almost like your brain's fight or flight mode kicks in. Blue Velvet and Twin Peaks are famous for creating that perfect balance of a bright, happy 50s Americana town with a dark and seedy underbelly, with Twin Peaks incorporating supernatural elements to heighten the effect. They've absolutely tried to replicate that here, and though it's way less subtle, it's still decently effective. By the time you get to the lodge, if you can ignore the game's absolutely terrible combat and bad enemy design, the full-on surrealism is right on display. Similar to Twin Peaks' own Black Lodge, though immensely less effective. The game shoots itself in the foot with its ending, in which it explains that the whole thing was a simulation set up by killers to find new candidates. This dampens the entire experience and is one of the reasons why Lynch's work is so effective. He refuses to outright tell the audience how or why things are the way they are. That's not the only problem with this game. It's probably the hardest one I'm talking about in this video to recommend, and that's not just because it's archaic and dated. It's because Harvester sometimes feels like it was written by an edgy middle schooler, but the writing is not why I like this game. Harvester just has a vibe to it that's genuinely terrifying. and it uses its influences of the horror elements of David Lynch's work to great effect. Though Harvester doesn't stick the landing and has its issues, it is a truly unique experience. It's like Lynch at his darkest in an interactive medium. It's genuinely one of the most unnerving pieces of media I've ever experienced, video game or not. And though it truly stands on its own as a weird and flawed time capsule of the era, it likely would not have turned out nearly the same without David Lynch. Another game inspired by Twin Peaks in particular is Alan Wake. Though it arguably owes as much to David Lynch as it does to Stephen King, especially pertaining to the act of writing itself, Alan Wake is filled with nods to the series, even playing into an episodic structure itself. This one is somewhere between Silent Hill 2 and Harvester, where it's not obscure enough for me to not care about spoiling it, and it's not popular enough to where you probably already know the ending. So I'm going to refrain from discussing any endgame plot details, but I will touch on minor spoilers. To understand the link between this game and David Lynch, you can look no further than the first 10 minutes or so of gameplay. The game takes place in Bright Falls, Washington, a fictional Pacific Northwest town with kooky characters that seems bright and beautiful on the exterior while hiding something dark beneath its surface. This is a common theme in Lynch's work that I've already touched on a bit with Harvester. I'll say that this game's stylistic influence is even more overt. This game probably takes more inspiration from Twin Peaks as a setting than the other two games I'm discussing in this video. But there are also some plot similarities and subtle nods to the show. There's a strange lady holding a lamp who appears near the beginning and then becomes relevant to the plot later to help you. There's an alternate, darker dimension that feels right out of the show, and even a doppelganger. We'll talk even more about doppelgangers later as it pertains to Silent Hill, but you can't help but draw the comparison between Cooper at the end of Twin Peaks' second season and what happens near the end of Alan Wake. I have a good bit less to say about this one compared to the others because Alan Wake is, in my opinion, quite an underrated game. Or at least it was until Control and Alan Wake 2 came out. And part of me feels like I've already said too much if you plan on playing it yourself, so I'll leave it by saying Alan Wake is a confident and unique title that draws from a lot of places. There's even a Twilight Zone parody in the game, which I loved. With that being said, if you love Twin Peaks and David Lynch's other work, you're going to get a lot out of this one. Maybe the most popular game series that takes influence from David Lynch's work is the Silent Hill series, specifically the second game. Silent Hill has a lot of influences. The film Jacob's Ladder and its twitchy, highly unsettling, shaking head effect was used to make the monsters in Silent Hill feel unpredictable. Artists Andrew Wyeth and Francis Bacon also inspired Silent Hill in different ways, with Wyeth likely inspiring the abstract and almost liminal feel of Silent Hill 2's art direction, and Bacon seemingly inspiring Silent Hill's outright surreal horror. And though Silent Hill 2's art direction is not necessarily Lynchian on its own, the game borrows a lot from his works when it comes to plot and feel. The game specifically mirrors Lost Highway's major plot point pretty nicely. Both deal with guilt, shame, and the wall the major character builds in their psyche as a means to deal with that. All the while, the world crumbles around them in ways they can't explain. There's also Mary and Maria in the game. It's almost impossible to not draw similarities here to Lynch's own fascination with doppelgangers and foils in his work. Pairs like Laura and Maddie in Twin Peaks, Renee and Alice in Lost Highway, Nikki and Sue in Inland Empire, Betty, Diane, Rita, and Camilla in Mulholland Drive. Lynch is obsessed with characters that are both the same but completely different, split personalities. This not only applies to Mary and Maria, but also to James himself. It's hard not to see James at the end of Silent Hill 2 as a completely different person to James at the beginning, which feels quite a bit like the difference in characterization with Betty and Diane in Mulholland Drive. One is the idealized, naive version who believes they're doing the right thing, and the other is a person of immense guilt who hates themselves for what they've done. As you progress in the story of Silent Hill 2, this applies to Maria as well. She starts the game as the promiscuous, idealized version of James's wife, who immediately shows attraction to him. But as the game goes on, and it becomes clear that Maria is just a way for James's own subconscious to punish him, she begins to demean and demoralize him. The cracks in James' fragile psyche begin to show, and the dream begins to crumble, just like in the last 30 minutes of Mulholland Drive, when the real story begins to come together. Silent Hill 2 is of course an original work and one of the greatest game stories ever told, but it's easy to draw parallels like this. It's worth mentioning that Silent Hill 2 is actually considerably darker than some of Lynch's more popular work. It doesn't have that comfort show vibe the first 2 seasons of Twin Peaks or Blue Velvet managed to achieve, but it strikingly almost predicts the nearly hopeless feeling of the show's return in 3rd season, a David Lynch work that also prominently features doppelgangers as a plot point. It's also worth mentioning that the Ingmar Bergman film Persona is owed a lot of credit for likely influencing Lynch's fascination with this particular plot point to begin with, and it's not something that Lynch invented. But the way that Silent Hill 2 incorporates James's actions into the story, as well as the characters of Mary and Maria, certainly draw parallels to the work of David Lynch. Another thing that reminds me of Lynch's work is the stilted dialogue.
There's only the one road. You can't miss it.
Thanks.
But
Yes?
I think you'd better stay away. This town, there's something wrong with it.
It's easy to mistake this as poor direction or voice acting, but it couldn't be further from the truth. Think of the way people speak in certain David Lynch films.
Okay, Irene. Won't that be the day?
The almost alien dialogue adds to the unnerving feeling, and the same principle applies in Silent Hill 2. In the case of SH2 and films like Mulholland Drive, this serves the purpose of creating an uncanny atmosphere, but it also adds to the weight of scenes later on, when the characters begin acting in incredibly realistic and human ways. In SH2, it's the jail scene, and in Mulholland Drive, it's the audition scene. These are 2 very different scenes on paper, but serve the same overall story purpose: to shock the audience with just a moment of complete clarity and focus.
You said you took everything, but you forgot that videotape we made. I wonder if it's still there.
I'm not quite sure how to wrap this video up. This is an idea I've had for a while, but now felt like the best time to get this out there. I know this is pretty different from the content I generally make, but now seemed like the right time to share my profound love of David Lynch's work. Even making this video feels like it's downplaying everything he's done, not only for film but for music, TV, and honestly, art as a whole. As you likely know, David Lynch passed on January 16th, 2025, and though I knew I'd probably live to see it, I really didn't want to believe it. I wish I could do more to honor someone who's genuinely changed my life. He was my favorite artist, and someone whose work I was so obsessed with that I annoyed my friends for years. So though it might seem like a tenuous exercise to compare his work to some of my favorite games, what it really makes me think of is all the times I was playing a game or listening to a song with a friend and went, hey, that reminds me of David Lynch for this reason. And the truth is, for the last few years, everything has reminded me of this guy. So consider this my tribute to him, as the connection I feel to his work and the work inspired by him grows stronger every day. Thank you for watching.